You are William de Montfort, 14 years old, and the year is 1347 A.D. Your hands tremble as you stand in the cold stone chamber beneath Warwick Castle, exposed and vulnerable in the harsh silence. The older knights circle you like wolves, their eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation in the flickering torchlight. You've trained for years to earn your spurs, mastered swordplay and horsemanship, proven your courage in battle, but nothing has prepared you for what these men are about to do to you. The heavy wooden door slams shut behind you with the finality of a tomb. Sir Geoffrey approaches, his scarred face twisted into a predatory smile. Behind him, 6 seasoned knights begin removing their own garments, their movements deliberate and menacing. You realize with growing horror that this isn't about honor or brotherhood. This is about power, dominance, and the systematic breaking of young men who dare to join their ranks. What you don't know is that you're about to experience one of history's most closely guarded secrets. The sexual initiation rituals that transformed medieval knights from innocent boys into hardened warriors through systematic humiliation and violation. These weren't isolated incidents or aberrant behavior. They were institutionalized traditions that every knight endured. Traditions so horrific that the very survivors who perpetuated them would take these secrets to their graves. The practice of knight initiation through sexual degradation was not an accident of medieval culture, but a deliberate system designed to create absolute loyalty through shared trauma. What you're about to discover will shatter every romantic notion you've ever held about medieval chivalry and knighthood. The Round Table was built on a foundation of broken boys and shattered innocence. Before we descend into these buried chambers of medieval horror, if uncovering these dark historical truths feeds your hunger for understanding how power really operated in the past, consider subscribing to continue this journey into history's most forbidden secrets. The stories that lie ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about honor, courage, and the price of belonging to the medieval warrior class. The origins of sexual initiation in knighthood trace back to the earliest warrior societies of post-Roman Europe. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 after Christ, the organized military structures that had maintained order for centuries crumbled with it. Local warlords filled the vacuum, creating private armies bound by personal loyalty rather than institutional duty. These early warrior bands needed methods to ensure absolute obedience and unbreakable bonds between fighters. The Germanic tribes that swept across Europe brought with them ancient traditions of warrior initiation that predated Christianity by centuries. These rituals recognized that young men entering military service needed to be fundamentally transformed from civilians into killers. The process required breaking down their previous identity and rebuilding them according to warrior values. Sexual humiliation became central to this transformation because it created a shared experience of vulnerability that bound initiates to their new brotherhood. The Frankish kingdoms of the 6th and 7th centuries developed increasingly sophisticated initiation practices as they struggled to maintain military effectiveness across vast territories. Charlemagne's military reforms in the late 8th century attempted to standardize warrior training, but the sexual aspects of initiation persisted in modified forms. The emperor himself had reportedly endured such rituals as a young man, understanding their effectiveness in creating loyal soldiers, even as he publicly embraced Christian values that condemned such practices. The crystallization of knighthood as a distinct social class during the 10th and 11th centuries institutionalized these initiation traditions within the emerging feudal system. Knights were no longer just warriors. They were a hereditary caste with specific rights, obligations, and internal codes. The sexual initiation rituals evolved to reflect this elevated status, becoming more elaborate and psychologically sophisticated. They served not only to create military loyalty, but to reinforce the exclusive nature of knightly brotherhood. The Church's attitude toward these practices revealed the complex relationship between Christian doctrine and medieval political realities. While official church teaching condemned all forms of sexual violation, the practical needs of Christian rulers for effective military forces led to tacit acceptance of initiation rituals. Bishops who blessed knights before battle knew what these men had endured to earn their spurs. Yet they chose spiritual pragmatism over doctrinal purity. The economic structure of feudalism reinforced the necessity of these initiation practices. Knights received land grants in exchange for military service, creating a system where personal loyalty to one's lord was literally a matter of survival. The sexual initiation rituals created psychological bonds that transcended mere economic obligation. A knight who had been violated alongside his brothers would die before betraying them, because betrayal would mean acknowledging the meaninglessness of his own suffering. The geographic spread of these practices across medieval Europe demonstrates their systematic nature. From the castles of Norman England to the hill fortresses of northern Italy, from the frontier strongholds of Eastern Europe to the Crusader kingdoms of the Holy Land, young men entering knighthood faced similar ordeals. The specific details varied by region and military order, but the underlying pattern remained consistent: systematic sexual humiliation designed to break and remake human beings. The age at which boys faced these initiation rituals typically ranged from 14 to 16, the traditional transition from page to squire to knight. This timing was not coincidental. Medieval understanding of human development, influenced by classical sources and medical theory, recognized adolescence as a period of maximum psychological malleability. Boys at this age could be most effectively reshaped through trauma, their personalities still fluid enough to absorb new loyalties and values. The preparation phase for sexual initiation began months before the actual ceremony. Older knights would observe potential candidates, identifying those who showed promise as warriors, but might lack the psychological hardness needed for medieval combat. These boys would be subjected to increasingly intimate forms of hazing, ostensibly as training exercises, but actually as psychological conditioning for what was to come. The candidates themselves often sensed something ominous approaching. Letters and diary entries from the period, preserved in monastery archives, reveal young men expressing anxiety about their upcoming elevation to knighthood. They understood that some transformative ordeal awaited them, though the specific nature remained hidden. This anticipatory fear was itself part of the psychological preparation, making the boys more susceptible to the trauma that would follow. The actual initiation ceremonies typically took place in underground chambers or isolated tower rooms where screams could not be heard. These locations were chosen deliberately to reinforce the secrecy and inescapability of what was happening. The boys entered these spaces as individuals. They would emerge, if they emerged, as branded members of an exclusive brotherhood united by shared suffering. The systematic nature of sexual violation during knight initiation followed patterns that were remarkably consistent across different regions and time periods. The rituals typically began with forced nudity, stripping away not just clothing, but the social identities that had protected the boys throughout their childhood. Standing naked before armored men, the initiates experienced their first taste of absolute vulnerability. The senior knights conducting these initiations had themselves survived similar ordeals, years or decades earlier. This created a perpetual cycle of abuse where victims became perpetrators, each generation passing on the trauma they had endured. The psychological mechanism was simple, yet devastating. Having suffered such degradation themselves, the older knights needed to believe it had served a noble purpose. Inflicting the same suffering on others validated their own experiences and maintained the system's legitimacy. The physical violations began gradually, with seemingly minor infractions that escalated into full assault. A boy might be ordered to perform degrading tasks while naked, then punished for hesitation with increasingly intimate forms of correction. The knights understood that sudden, overwhelming violence would break the boys completely. making them useless as future warriors. Instead, they employed a systematic escalation that maintained enough of the victim's will to ensure active participation in their own degradation. The role of alcohol and drugs in these ceremonies cannot be understated. Medieval knights had access to various substances that could alter consciousness and reduce resistance. Wine mixed with herbs that induced docility was commonly administered to initiates. Some chronicles mention the use of opium-based compounds obtained through trade networks with the Middle East. These substances served dual purposes. They made the boys more compliant during the assault and created psychological barriers to clear memory formation. The sexual acts forced upon the initiates ranged from humiliating displays to violent penetration. The boys were required to perform acts upon each other while the senior knights observed and directed. They were violated by the older men in ways that medieval society considered utterly damning, acts that would make them social outcasts if revealed. The shame of these experiences created an unbreakable bond of secrecy among the survivors. The psychological techniques employed during these rituals revealed sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The knights alternated between brutality and apparent kindness, creating emotional confusion that made resistance more difficult. A boy might be violated by one knight, then comforted by another who positioned himself as a protector. This manipulation created complex emotional relationships that persisted long after the initiation ended. The duration of these initiation periods varied, but typically lasted several days or even weeks. The boys were held in isolation, subjected to repeated assaults that became routine rather than exceptional. This normalization of violence and violation was crucial to the process. By the end, the initiates no longer reacted with shock or resistance. They had been conditioned to accept their degradation as natural and inevitable. The role of witnesses in these ceremonies added another layer of psychological complexity. Older knights who were not directly participating in the sexual violence were required to observe and occasionally assist. This created a web of complicity that extended beyond the immediate perpetrators. Every knight in the Brotherhood bore some responsibility for what happened in those chambers, making collective resistance impossible. The medical care provided to the boys during and after their ordeals reveals the systematic nature of these practices. Castle physicians were aware of the initiation rituals and prepared treatments for the physical damage they caused. Records from monastery infirmaries describe treating young knights for internal injuries, psychological trauma, and infections that could only have resulted from sexual assault. The fact that medical professionals were integrated into this system demonstrates how thoroughly institutionalized these practices had become. The suicide rate among boys undergoing knight initiation was significant, though carefully concealed by the military orders. When a candidate took his own life rather than endure further degradation, his death was typically attributed to training accidents or enemy action. The church provided burial rites for these boys, blessing their graves, while knowing they had died to escape the very system the church supported through its blessing of knights and their military campaigns. Now that you've witnessed the systematic nature of how young knights were broken through sexual violence, you're beginning to see the patterns hidden beneath medieval chivalry's golden veneer. If uncovering these buried truths about how power really operated in feudal society resonates with your curiosity about the real human experience behind historical myths, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into history's most guarded secrets. The stories waiting ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about honor, courage, and the price of power in the medieval world, necessary preparation for the ascetic life of a warrior monk. The secrecy surrounding these practices was justified through references to mystery religions and esoteric traditions. Church scholars argued that certain spiritual truths were too profound for common understanding and required special preparation to receive. The sexual initiation of knights was positioned as one of these sacred mysteries, a secret teaching that could only be transmitted through direct experience rather than intellectual instruction. The role of confession in managing the psychological aftermath of these rituals demonstrates the Church's active participation in perpetuating the system. Priests who heard the confessions of traumatized young knights were trained to interpret their suffering as spiritual purification rather than violation. They provided absolution, not just for any sins the boys might have committed during their ordeal, but for the very experience of being violated, reframing victimization as participation in divine mystery. The theological concept of necessary evil played a crucial role in rationalizing these practices. Church scholars argued that in a fallen world, certain harmful actions became necessary to achieve greater goods. The sexual violation of young knights was positioned as one of these necessary evils, a temporary corruption that produced long-term spiritual and military benefits for Christian society. The integration of pagan warrior traditions into Christian theology required sophisticated intellectual gymnastics. The sexual initiation rituals clearly derived from pre-Christian Germanic and Celtic practices, but church scholars reinterpreted these pagan elements as prefigurations of Christian truth. They argued that God had prepared the barbarian tribes for Christianity by implanting these initiation traditions, which only achieve their full meaning when practiced within a Christian framework. The cult of military saints provided role models for knights undergoing sexual initiation. Saints like Sebastian, who was depicted as a beautiful young man pierced by arrows, and Lawrence, who was tortured on a gridiron, became symbols of sacred suffering that knights could emulate. The sexual violation of initiates was compared to the torments of these saints, positioning the boys as participants in a sacred tradition of masculine suffering. The theological discussions surrounding consent and free will in these practices reveal the intellectual sophistication of medieval justifications for systematic abuse. Church scholars argued that true spiritual consent could only emerge after the destruction of worldly attachments and false identities. The boys entering initiation were considered incapable of giving meaningful consent to their spiritual transformation because they were still trapped in their civilian identities. Only after being broken and remade through violation could they achieve the spiritual maturity necessary to understand and embrace their true calling. The eschatological dimensions of these justifications positioned the sexual initiation of knights within the broader framework of salvation history. Church theologians argued that the end times would require a generation of warriors pure enough to serve as instruments of divine judgment. The sexual violation of young knights was interpreted as preparation for this cosmic role, a necessary purification that would enable them to participate in the final battle between good and evil. The development of specialized liturgies for knight initiation ceremonies demonstrates the Church's institutional commitment to these practices. These liturgies combine traditional prayers and biblical readings with rituals specifically designed to sanctify sexual violation. The boys undergoing initiation were required to participate in these religious ceremonies, creating psychological associations between their suffering and divine approval. The network of monasteries and religious houses that supported knight initiation extended across medieval Europe. These institutions provided both theological justification and practical support for the sexual violation of young men. Monks and priests who had themselves undergone similar ordeals as part of their religious training understood the transformative potential of systematic degradation and worked to extend these practices to the military orders. The intellectual traditions surrounding these practices included detailed theological treatises that were circulated among religious and military elites. These texts provided sophisticated arguments for the necessity and righteousness of sexual initiation, drawing upon sources ranging from the early church fathers to contemporary scholastic philosophy. The existence of this literature demonstrates that the sexual violation of young knights was not a spontaneous development, but a carefully theorized and deliberately implemented system. The resistance to these practices from reform-minded church leaders reveals that not all religious authorities accepted the theological justifications for sexual initiation. Monastic reformers and mystical theologians occasionally challenged the system, arguing that true spiritual purification could not emerge from such degrading practices. However, these voices of opposition were consistently marginalized by the practical needs of military orders and the political influence of established knightly families. The long-term psychological effects on knights who survived sexual initiation created a warrior class uniquely suited to medieval warfare's psychological demands. The systematic breaking and rebuilding of their identities produced men capable of extraordinary violence while maintaining functional relationships within their military brotherhoods. Understanding these effects requires examining how trauma shapes personality development and social bonding in ways that serve the strategic needs of medieval military organizations. The dissociation that resulted from sexual trauma became a crucial psychological tool for knights in combat. Men who had learned to disconnect from their physical bodies during violation could more easily endure the pain and horror of medieval battle. The ability to function while experiencing extreme trauma, developed during initiation, translated directly to effectiveness in warfare, where psychological breakdown could mean death for oneself and one's companions. The emotional numbing that followed sexual initiation created knights who could commit acts of extreme violence without normal human emotional responses. The systematic destruction of empathy during the initiation process produced warriors capable of sacking cities, executing prisoners, and burning villages without the psychological distress that would incapacitate untrained men. This emotional deadness was not a bug in the system, but a feature deliberately cultivated through sexual trauma. The hypervigilance developed during initiation served knights well in the dangerous environment of medieval warfare. Boys who had learned to constantly monitor their surroundings for threats of sexual violence became men who could detect ambushes, anticipate enemy movements, and react instantly to changing battlefield conditions. The paranoid awareness born of trauma transformed into tactical advantage in military contexts. The formation of trauma bonds during sexual initiation created military units with extraordinary cohesion and loyalty. Knights who had suffered together developed emotional connections that transcended normal friendship or professional relationships. These bonds made military formations more resilient under pressure, as individual knights would fight desperately to protect brothers with whom they shared such intimate trauma. The shame associated with sexual violation created a warrior class that was psychologically dependent on their military identity for self-worth. Knights who had been systematically degraded during initiation needed to prove their worth through acts of courage and violence. This psychological need for redemption through warfare made them more aggressive and risk-taking in battle, qualities that served medieval military commanders well. The secret-keeping skills developed during initiation proved invaluable in the intelligence and diplomatic aspects of medieval warfare. Knights who had learned to maintain absolute silence about their sexual degradation could be trusted with military secrets, diplomatic missions, and covert operations. The psychological conditioning that prevented them from revealing their initiation experiences extended to other forms of classified information. The authority structures established during sexual initiation replicated themselves in military hierarchies throughout knights' careers. Men who had learned to submit absolutely to sexual domination during their youth continued to show similar obedience to military superiors throughout their lives. Conversely, those who advanced to leadership positions understood how to use sexual humiliation and degradation as tools of control over their subordinates. The religious framework surrounding sexual initiation created knights who could reconcile extreme violence with Christian identity through psychological compartmentalization. The theological justifications they had absorbed during their traumatic initiation allowed them to maintain faith while committing acts that would normally provoke religious guilt. This psychological flexibility was essential for warriors who needed to function as both Christians and killers. The sexual dysfunction that often resulted from initiation trauma created a warrior class with complex relationships to intimacy and family life. Many knights struggled with normal romantic relationships, finding it easier to form emotional connections with fellow warriors who understood their psychological damage. This dysfunction reinforced their dependence on military brotherhoods and reduced competing loyalties that might interfere with military service. The transmission of trauma through generations created military families where sexual initiation became a hereditary tradition. Knights who had survived these ordeals often insisted that their own sons undergo similar experiences, believing that anything less would inadequately prepare them for the realities of warrior life. This intergenerational transmission of trauma helped perpetuate the system across centuries. The development of specialized combat techniques that channeled trauma responses into tactical advantages demonstrates the sophisticated understanding medieval military leaders had of trauma psychology. Knights learned fighting styles that transformed their hypervigilance, dissociation, and emotional numbing into combat effectiveness. The very symptoms of their psychological damage became weapons in their martial arsenal. The use of sexual humiliation as ongoing disciplinary tools within knightly orders reveals how initiation trauma was reinforced throughout knights' careers. Military leaders who understood the psychological impact of sexual degradation continued to use these techniques to maintain control over their forces. Knights who stepped out of line might face renewed sexual humiliation, reactivating the trauma responses established during their initiation. The psychological preparation for death that resulted from sexual initiation created warriors with reduced fear of mortality. Men who had experienced psychological death during their violation were less afraid of physical death in battle. This fearlessness, born of trauma, made them more effective fighters and more willing to take the extreme risks that medieval warfare often demanded. The development of elaborate codes of honor and chivalric behavior served as psychological compensation for the shame of sexual initiation. Knights who had been systematically degraded needed to create new sources of self-worth and social identity. The complex rituals of courtly behavior, romantic love, and martial honor provided alternative narratives that allowed them to maintain dignity despite their traumatic past. The creation of military religious orders provided institutional frameworks that normalized and perpetuated the psychological effects of sexual initiation. These organizations created environments where trauma-bonded warriors could function effectively while maintaining the religious justifications that made their experiences bearable. The success of orders like the Knights Templar demonstrates how effectively sexual trauma could be channeled into military effectiveness when properly institutionalized. The specific rituals and ceremonies that surrounded knight initiation varied by region and military order, but certain elements remained remarkably consistent across medieval Europe. These standardized practices suggest coordinated development rather than independent evolution, indicating that military leaders actively shared techniques for sexual degradation that proved most effective in creating loyal warriors. The preparation of initiation chambers followed established patterns that maximized psychological impact on young candidates. These rooms were typically located in the deepest parts of castles or monasteries, accessible only through narrow passages that heightened the sense of descent into an underworld. The chambers themselves were designed to be simultaneously sacred and terrifying, combining religious imagery with instruments of sexual torture. The timing of initiation ceremonies was carefully coordinated with religious festivals and military campaigns. Many orders conducted their most intensive sexual rituals during Lent, positioning the degradation of young knights as participation in Christ's Passion. Others timed initiations to coincide with the departure of crusading armies, creating immediate opportunities for the newly traumatized knights to channel their psychological damage into holy warfare. The selection of senior knights to conduct sexual initiations followed specific criteria that ensured the most effective breaking of young candidates. The ideal perpetrators were men who had themselves survived similar ordeals and demonstrated exceptional military skill, proving that sexual trauma could be transformed into tactical advantage. These nights served as living examples of how degradation could lead to greatness, making the violation more psychologically acceptable to their victims. The progressive escalation of sexual demands during initiation followed carefully developed protocols that prevented complete psychological breakdown while ensuring maximum impact. The process typically began with forced nudity and humiliating positions, progressed through various forms of touching and oral contact, and culminated in anal penetration that symbolically reversed the natural order of masculine dominance. The use of symbolic objects and ritualistic elements transformed crude sexual assault into elaborate ceremonial experiences that were easier for participants to interpret as spiritually meaningful. Consecrated candles, holy water, and religious relics were incorporated into sexual acts, creating psychological associations between divine presence and physical violation that persisted throughout the knight's careers. The documentation of these practices in coded language allowed military orders to maintain written records while concealing the true nature of their activities from outside observers. Initiation ceremonies were described in terms of spiritual purification, physical trials, and sacred mysteries that could be interpreted innocuously by uninitiated readers, while providing detailed instructions for those who understood the coded references. The role of music and chanting during sexual initiation ceremonies demonstrates the sophisticated psychological techniques employed by medieval military orders. Specific hymns and prayers were adapted to accompany sexual acts, creating auditory associations between religious devotion and physical violation. The boys undergoing initiation learned to associate sacred music with their degradation, programming psychological responses that could be triggered in future religious services. The provision of special foods and drinks during initiation periods served both practical and symbolic purposes. Candidates were fed diets designed to increase their physical sensitivity while reducing their ability to resist. Symbolic foods associated with fertility and masculinity were incorporated into sexual rituals, creating complex psychological associations between nourishment and degradation. The system of rewards and punishments during initiation encouraged active participation in one's own violation, while creating false hope for relief. Boys who showed enthusiasm for degrading acts might receive better food, more comfortable sleeping arrangements, or temporary reprieve from the worst abuses. This conditioning created psychological dependencies that persisted long after the initiation ended. The integration of competitive elements into sexual initiation pitted candidates against each other in ways that prevented solidarity and mutual support. Boys were required to participate in contests to see who could endure the most degrading acts or perform the most enthusiastic service to their tormentors. These competitions created hierarchies among the victims that divided potential allies. The use of isolation techniques between group activities prevented candidates from forming relationships that might provide emotional support or encourage resistance. Boys were kept in separate cells when not participating in group activities, depriving them of opportunities to process their experiences or plan collective action. This isolation made each individual more dependent on their tormentors for human contact. The graduation ceremonies that marked the end of sexual initiation created positive associations with the traumatic experience while establishing ongoing obligations to the system. Successful candidates received their knightly spurs, weapons, and other symbols of status in ceremonies that positioned their degradation as necessary preparation for these honors. The psychological relief of ending the initiation became associated with gratitude toward the system that had tormented them. The oath-taking ceremonies that concluded initiation bound the new knights to secrecy while creating religious obligations to perpetuate the system. The candidates swore sacred vows to protect the secrets of their brotherhood and to guide future initiates through similar ordeals. These oaths were backed by threats of damnation that made violation seem worse than the original trauma. The mentorship relationships established during initiation created ongoing psychological control over new knights throughout their careers. Senior knights who had participated in a candidate's sexual violation became his sponsors and guides in military life, maintaining intimate psychological leverage that could be used to ensure continued obedience and silence. The network of alumni created by these initiation practices extended across medieval Europe, creating informal communication systems that allowed military orders to coordinate activities and share intelligence. Knights who had undergone similar sexual ordeals recognized each other through subtle signs and coded language, forming bonds that transcended formal military and political boundaries. The adaptation of these practices to local conditions demonstrates the flexibility and sophistication of the overall system. While the core elements of sexual degradation remained constant, specific techniques were modified to accommodate regional religious traditions, local customs, and available resources. This adaptability helped ensure the survival and spread of these practices across diverse cultural contexts. The training programs developed to prepare senior knights for conducting sexual initiations reveal the systematic nature of these practices. Experienced knights who showed aptitude for psychological manipulation and sexual domination received specialized instruction in techniques for breaking young men while preserving their military potential. These training programs ensured consistency and effectiveness across different military orders and geographic regions. The climax of every knight's sexual initiation involved a final ceremony that sealed their transformation from innocent boys into members of a warrior brotherhood bound by shared trauma and mutual complicity. This ultimate ritual typically occurred after weeks or months of progressive degradation, when the candidates had been psychologically broken down to the point where they would accept any act as normal and necessary. The final violation ceremony took place in the presence of the entire knightly brotherhood, transforming individual trauma into collective witness. Every knight who had previously undergone the same ordeal participated either as observer or active perpetrator, creating a web of shared guilt that made future resistance impossible. The boy being initiated understood that every man watching him had once stood in his place, and that he would someday watch others endure the same degradation. The symbolic elements of this final ceremony transformed the sexual assault into a ritual of death and rebirth that the knights could interpret as spiritually meaningful rather than simply traumatic. The candidate was required to lie naked on a stone altar, positioned like a sacrifice to ancient gods, while senior knights performed acts that symbolically killed his civilian identity and impregnated him with warrior essence. The religious language used during these final ceremonies combined Christian prayers with pre-Christian invocations that positioned the sexual violation as necessary for spiritual transformation. The boy being assaulted was required to recite specific phrases declaring his willingness to die for his brothers, his acceptance of whatever suffering was necessary for the greater good, and his gratitude for being chosen to receive these sacred mysteries. The physical marking that occurred during the final ceremony left permanent reminders of the initiation that the knights would carry throughout their lives. These marks, typically carved or burned into intimate areas of the body, served both as proof of membership in the brotherhood and as constant reminders of the price paid for that membership. The scars became sources of both shame and pride, symbols of survival and belonging. The psychological breaking point that the final ceremony was designed to achieve represents the moment when the candidate's original personality was destroyed and replaced with the warrior identity that would define the rest of his life. The boys who entered these chambers ceased to exist as individuals. The knights who emerged were collective creatures, defined entirely by their relationship to the brotherhood that had created them through systematic destruction. The immediate aftermath of the final ceremony involved a period of psychological reconstruction, during which the new knights were taught to interpret their traumatic experiences as positive and necessary. Senior knights who had participated in the violation now became gentle mentors, explaining how the degradation had prepared them for the glorious life of a warrior. This rapid shift from tormentor to protector created complex emotional bonds that made resistance psychologically impossible. The first acts of violence that new knights were required to commit immediately after their sexual initiation served to channel their trauma into aggression against external enemies rather than their tormentors. These carefully orchestrated military actions allowed the newly initiated knights to experience the psychological relief of inflicting on others the kind of suffering they had endured, beginning the cycle that would perpetuate the system across generations. The integration of new knights into active military service provided immediate purpose and meaning for their traumatic experiences. Boys who had been sexually violated weeks earlier found themselves fighting alongside the men who had tormented them, experiencing the brotherhood and mutual dependence that military campaigns created. The effectiveness of trauma-bonded warriors in combat validated the system in the minds of both perpetrators and victims. The first return home of newly initiated knights reveals the complete transformation that sexual initiation had accomplished. Boys who had left their families as children returned as hardened warriors, psychologically incapable of resuming their previous relationships. Parents often reported that their sons seemed like different people, displaying new behaviors and attitudes that reflected their traumatic transformation. The ongoing psychological management of initiated knights required careful balance between maintaining the trauma bonds that ensured loyalty while allowing enough psychological healing to preserve military effectiveness. Too much recovery might lead to questioning of the system. Too little could result in complete breakdown. Military orders developed sophisticated techniques for managing this balance throughout knights' careers. You came into this story thinking medieval knighthood represented the pinnacle of honor and chivalry, and now you leave understanding the systematic sexual violence that actually created these legendary warriors. This transformation of perspective is exactly why these hidden histories matter. If this journey of discovery has awakened your appetite for truth about how power really operated in the past, subscribing means you'll continue accessing these revelations that textbooks won't teach. Your curiosity about the real human experience behind historical myths deserves to be fed. Because while others believe the fairy tales about noble knights, you'll know what really happened in those initiation chambers. The evidence for these practices comes from multiple sources that historians have long misunderstood or deliberately ignored. Chronicle accounts that describe mysterious initiation rites, confession manuals that address specific types of military sexual trauma, architectural evidence from castle chambers designed for sexual torture, and artistic depictions that use coded imagery to represent these forbidden practices all point to the systematic nature of sexual violence in medieval knighthood. The conspiracy of silence that protected these practices extended beyond the military orders themselves to include the church hierarchy, noble families, and even royal courts that depended on the military effectiveness of traumatized warriors. The very success of medieval armies in conquest and defense validated the brutal methods used to create them, making reform seem not just unnecessary, but dangerous to social stability. The legacy of medieval knight initiation practices extends far beyond the Middle Ages, influencing military training, fraternal organizations, and elite institutions that continue to use sexual humiliation as tools of bonding and control. Understanding these historical roots helps explain how systematic abuse can become normalized within organizations that claim to represent the highest ideals of service and honor. The price of belonging to the medieval warrior class was measured not in gold or blood, but in innocence lost and humanity sacrificed on the altar of military effectiveness. The boys who entered those initiation chambers, carrying dreams of glory and honor, emerged as broken men, bound together by shared trauma. Their capacity for normal human relationships destroyed in service of a military system that valued loyalty above all else. The light of torches still flickers across the scarred faces of knights gathering in that stone chamber. But now you understand that this moment contains the entire horror of medieval military culture. The terror in young William's eyes, the predatory satisfaction of his tormentors, and the systematic destruction of human dignity, all in service of creating warriors capable of the extraordinary violence that defined medieval warfare. In their trembling hands and calloused fingers, you see not just individuals but the collision of innocence with the brutal realities of power, played out in the most intimate spaces imaginable, but never truly private, never truly consensual, never truly forgotten by those who survived to perpetuate the cycle that defined medieval knighthood.